An evening to celebrate Baudelaire. It's 200 years, it's his bicentenary, and we are all very, very happy to be here to celebrate this poet, this essayist, this translator. I mean, he's a man who was many, many things. And that is something, and Charles Baudelaire, it is very difficult to imagine, was a gentleman who was writing in the early part of the 19th century. His dates are 1821 to 1867, but 200 years on, when we still read him, he seems so modern, he seems so refreshing, he seems so relevant, he seems so topical, and there are so many interesting cues and that we can take from his writings. Of course, I unfortunately don't speak French, so I access him through translation, but that's maybe a quality that, you know, he's also considered to be one of the first translators because he translated Poe. Gathered with us today are four eminent panelists. And I mean, I find it very hard to introduce them because they're so eminent and they've done a lot of phenomenal work in their own right. But they're the perfect fit. They're the perfect fit to come on board and to discuss and analyze Charles Baudelaire, because all the people gathered here, whether it is Anupama Raju or Amrita Narayanan or Ranjit Hoskote and Jeet Thayil, they are I don't know how to describe them, except to say that they are poets, writers, they are multi-talented, and they are bilingual. More than that, they're translators. They share many of the qualities that Baudelaire himself, encapsulated and broke new ground in literature. Today, we take a lot of those talents for granted. The panelists today are like that, extremely talented. And what is extraordinary is that they're constantly producing a new works. And each one is very, very, is very new, is experimental, is refreshing. They surprise one with their work, whether it's his poetry, whether it's Anupama's poetry, whether it's Jeet's poetry. Jeet has come out with a new novel. Ranjit Hoskote has just come out with a new collection of poems called Hunch Prose. Again, there are elements in it which, they bring in translation, they bring in the prose poetry, etc., which Baudelaire is famous for having introduced. There's Amrita Narayanan, who does fascinating stuff. And of course, all of them, in one way or the other, are preoccupied with the subject of love, which of course is at the core of Baudelaire's poetry, I have to say. More his poetry than his essays. Anyway, we will have a lot of things to discuss. We will have a lot of things to discuss because apart from Baudelaire being the man he is, he was also a man who had very clear thoughts on what constitutes art, what is the importance of the reader, how is art created, how are cultural spaces created, what is the impact, what are the responsibilities of the artist. What are the theories? What is artistic vitality? It was a predicament which bothered him till the end. How do you remain relevant? Do you remain relevant? Do you comment as an artist? Is it your responsibility to comment on society and present it, or do you just create something art for art's sake? I mean, that's a concept which of course came later in the 19th century, but these were ideas he was already grappling with in anything. Also, it is it's very interesting that the French Institute in India is celebrating this gentleman because in 1841, he actually came to India. He was sent to India. But, there are, God knows whether he brought it, he was influenced in any way. But it is interesting that at the height of the 19th century, he was here in India and he was commenting. This was a man who grew up, who was part of the French bourgeoisie, but he chose to break out of those bonds and do many things. He himself, as a man, broke new ground. He did things which were unheard of in his time. And a lot of it begins to become evident in his writings. Anyway, now this, just to sort of briefly bring you through the program that we have planned, because it's a 1-hour program, we are going to invite the panelists one by one to come forth and speak about the impact, about Baudelaire, about themselves, their work of poetry. And it's going to be about 4 to 5 minutes to each panelist. And then we have a lovely surprise for our audience, followed by a conversation with the panelists. And then the last 15 minutes will be reserved for question and answers. So if anyone listening in has questions, please hold them. Please raise them at the end of this towards the end. We are very happy to take them on. So let's start. Let's start with Jeet. Jeet, would you like to start by talking about Baudelaire, etc., and how it influenced you?
Sure. I'm going to talk about Baudelaire for a second, and then read a poem called To Baudelaire. And I'm going to preface that by saying that I was 13 when I first began to read poems. And I wasn't reading it seriously. I wasn't reading poetry in any sort of serious way, but I was reading the poetry in my father's library. And I remember he had a collected poems of Dylan Thomas. He had James Joyce. He had Goethe, and he had Dante. And he had some of the mid-20th century British poets. And I remember reading those books, but it wasn't until I read an English translation by Edna St. Vincent Millay and George Dillon, two mid-20th century American poets, of some of Les Fleurs du Mal, that poetry struck me in a physical way. And I recognized that physicality of it many years later when I read Emily Dickinson's definition of poetry. And she said, you know a poem when the top of your head lifts off. And what she was trying to say was, you have a physical response to a poem. That's when you recognize it as poetry. And I remember having a physical response to this poem. It was Le Lethe, in translation by Dylan and Ed St. Vincent Millay. And at that time, I'd been studying poetry, studying French for a few years. So I could read the poem in the French very slowly with the dictionary, but the English translation absolutely struck me physically. And I still remember the opening lines, the quatrain that opens that translation, and it's an ABBA rhyme, and it goes like this. Come to my arms, cruel and sullen thing, indolent beast, come to my arms again, for I would plunge my fingers in your mane and be a long time unremembering. That's a George Dillon translation. What struck me when I read that opening quatrain, and of course the rest of the poem, but really it's those 4 lines that did it. What struck me was how modern it was. And when we say something is modern, I don't think that definition has changed much in the last 70 years. And in many ways, for me, Baudelaire really defines what is modern. And this is because, I'll just mention a couple of things why this is so for me. He embodied doubt.
Yeah.
He embodied a kind of an equality, and at the same time, a kind of very extreme elitism. He had equal contempt and love for the common man, in quotes. but the quality about him that still strikes me and that endears him to me is that he was struck, I would say hysterically struck, by art, by music, by poetry, and by prose. He took art seriously and he took it personally. And uh, you can see this in his essays and in the prose that he wrote about, for example, Delacroix, or about his contemporaries, the poets, about the way he wrote um, his essays about Poe, the translations of Poe. He took art so seriously that for him, you knew this was a man who wouldn't really be interested in a world that didn't include art, poetry, and music. And of course, what shines through in all that prose, particularly the poetry, I'm not even going to talk about at this point. What comes through in that prose is a shining and an uncompromising intelligence as well.
Yes.
And this still strikes us today. An intelligence tempered by illness, by doubt, by suspicion, by self-loathing, and by a, a visceral, emotional response to art that defined everything he did.
No, thank you for that, Jeet. I'm really thank you for that, because a lot of what you said is what struck me about him as well. As for the essay on Poe, it is something which I mean, is incredible. It was written nearly 200 years ago.
Yeah.
It seems, I mean, it is something which I have been recommending for widely, because I think it is something which a lot of us can still learn from it, you know. And you are right about, it's very hard to define what is modernism, but here is a man who in some sense embodies it, you know.
Of course, the thing about Poe, the reason that he really loved Poe, and you know, we have to say it because let's not deify him. He was as human as it's possible to be. The reason he loved Poe was because he thought Poe looked like he did. He thought they resembled each other. He thought they looked like brothers. And that was the real reason he loved Poe. And that just makes him so human.
Exactly. And you know, that essay, when it begins the way it does, I mean, it's just incredible that he recognizes that. And I mean, I certainly have no intention of deifying this man, but I just think that he has so many qualities which we can learn from and discuss, and there's so much to do. And one other point which I will raise later is, I found it interesting that you comment upon being able to have that visceral reaction to Baudelaire in English, in translation rather than in French, because I mean, I thought that I was missing something out by being able to only access him in English, whereas you, who are obviously familiar with both languages, is able to discern it. So thank you for raising that. It's a very perceptive point. Maybe I can invite Amrita now to come on and speak a bit about it, Baudelaire and herself.
Yeah, thanks, Jaya. So the effect that Baudelaire has had in authorizing the greed of my imagination is not something that I feel in a thoughtful reflection, but a rush of body feeling, as Jeet said. And so to compose these feelings into sentences, I thought I'd share a couple of memories that are associated with Baudelaire poems. In the first memory, it's the winter of 1996. I'm a 21-year-old student in Paris. I have a copy of Les Fleurs du Mal. The professor who gives it to me tells me that I should read from Tableaux Parisiennes. He knows that Paris is not always easy for me. I'm often cold. I'm poor in the way that students often are. And most of my time is with my books, up in my room in the home of a white French family who is upset that the American exchange student that they signed up for turned out to be Indian. They are upset also at my tendency to walk around the house barefoot. Flipping past Tableaux Parisiennes and Fleurs du Mal, I find Baudelaire's to a Malabar girl. Your feet are as agile as your hands. Your hips make well-endowed white women envious. Today, of course, I can say a lot about the poem What I Didn't Think. At 21, Baudelaire's gaze is exoticizing, it's orientalist. That Malabar girl is slave to a man amidst the tamarind and bananas. But at 21, homesick, when I first arrived in freezing Paris winter, I greeted that shivering Malabar girl as some version of myself. And it was with such relief that I read Baudelaire's lines. Poor happy child, you want to visit France, that crowded country where no one is well? It cheered me up. It corrected a power imbalance. I had this compulsion to make the most of France, but this was set right for me when Baudelaire reminded me that France too would like to make the most of India, of that Malabar girl. Like all great poetry, Baudelaire's unlocks and it meets you, even when you're removed from him in time and in geography. Maybe especially when you're removed from him in time and geography. Another such moment, it's 2016. I'm composing the introduction to The Parrots of Desire, an anthology of Indian erotic writing. I'm working in a tiny study. The floor is covered with books. I'm reading feverishly about the erotic. I'm not, of course, having much sex or dreaming about sex. It's much more interesting, compelling, and important to read, and I don't want to stop. And this, again, could be one of Baudelaire's best-known valorizations of excess from Enivrez-vous. One must always be drunk. That is the heart of the matter. So as not to feel the burden of time crushing your shoulders and bending you towards the earth, you must get drunk without rest. But on what? On poetry or on virtue, you choose, but get drunk. There's something about the way that Baudelaire is sympathetic to our desire for excess, and particularly to our desire to satisfy our excess by reading, for which we owe him something. We owe him also this amused suspicion towards the so-called respectable activity of reading. This point is picked up later on by Freud, but Baudelaire is one of the first witnesses to and companions of the reader's voyeuristic drive and that immortal hypocrite reader, my brother and my twin. But it's impossible actually to stay drunk continuously without rest, as he exhorts us to do. And being close to Baudelaire poses this question of how and whether it's possible to be intelligent and alive about excess and desire. And in this, I wonder if Baudelaire abandons us a bit, because he mocks us when we resign to boredom. He says our souls lack enterprise. And yet, so much of completing a poem, making a living, depends on a capacity to tolerate the mundane and the boring. As I complete my anthology, I title one of the sections Ennui in Marriage.
Yes, yes.
And I hadn't thought of Baudelaire for quite some time when I ran into one of Jeet's poems that's in 60 Indian Poets that's dedicated to Baudelaire. And the poem is titled To Baudelaire, and it begins, I have gotten over you at last. And we know at once that he hasn't. And he writes there, he writes twice, I don't miss you. I don't miss you. And of course we do. Of course we miss Baudelaire very much.
Well, I mean, that's such a lovely and a personal reaction. I mean, it's really interesting because the more one reads and accesses Baudelaire, this is one of the things which strikes me, is just as Jeet said, he read him first when he was 13 and you read him again as a student. It's extraordinary how he continues to speak to many. The other day I was listening to a program about Baudelaire, I mean, as part of the celebrations of his bicentenary. And he was constantly referred to as a rock artist of the 19th century, you know, as a pop artist. And the music which was being played was a lot of the underground music, which has become mainstream here now, pop, and it just fitted so beautifully with the recitations of Baudelaire, which were being recorded in the program. And your reaction is so interesting because this is one of the things which struck me a lot about while reading a lot of your works, was how much of it actually influenced you. And I wasn't reading your works because I was reading, trying to understand Baudelaire. I had read your works much before Baudelaire. So this is very, very interesting how you say this, how it came through in little ways. And that little interesting observation that you made, that you would probably read him differently now as you did as a youngster, is something we are going to come back after when we open the floor to conversation, because that was something which has also struck me a lot about Baudelaire, this fascination that he continues to have with readers. And yet, as we grow older, how does our perception of his change? So hold that thought, we'll come back to it. Ranjit, may I please invite you to come on and share your few thoughts on the man?
Sure, it's just been a great, thank you so much, Jaya. And it's really a pleasure to be here talking about Baudelaire. And all of us here are in some ways inheritors of his legacy. It's been a real pleasure to hear Jeet and Amrita speak about their particular encounters with his work. For me, Baudelaire was a presence early on, indeed. I had discovered his work as a teenager. It seemed to me to be both strange and alluring. There was something in it, possibly because one had by then already read so much about that period. You came to, at least I came to him with some sense of both anticipation and anxiety. As someone who came out of what we thought was this culture of decadence and bohemian experimentation and so on and so forth, it took a while to go past all of those impressions and associations with Baudelaire to really engage with his work. And when that happened, it happened in two phases. One was when I finished school and went to college. In Bombay, this meant moving out of a relatively secluded, protected, sort of private school to a college that was set in the heart of the colonial quarter and was wide open to the city, to the world, to diversity. So reading Baudelaire's poems at that point was sort of apprenticeship. And then I lost sight of him for many years until I went to Iowa, where I was on the international writing program. And there I discovered him, or rediscovered him, through his prose. And at that point, I was already very, very fascinated by questions of what the urban experiences meant. What does it mean to be modern? It's one thing to have that visceral experience and another to subject it to some kind of analytical inquiry and to see how much has changed. It struck me as we speak, it strikes me that modernity is 2 centuries old already.
Yes.
So it's a very strange thing that what we regard as being constantly and renewably of the moment also has a certain antiquity of its own. So it's that paradox that has always drawn me to Baudelaire. So it leads me to think, as I want to pick up on something that Jeet said as well, there's actually at least 2 different sides to Baudelaire, and both of them appeal to me. One is what I would speak about under the sign of rupture. It's the classic gesture of the modern. You break. He broke with a sort of residual neoclassicism that had evidently survived even the revolution and the Directory and everything, and continued into the 19th century. He broke also with academic canons, and to that extent, he was part of this long 19th century of mutiny and revolution and the statement of the shock of the new, if you will. So very much standing alongside all the artists who featured in the Salon des Refusés, very much part of that expanded metropolitan culture of which the Exposition Universelle was a huge part, the arrival of the metro, all of this, these new democratizing experiences that allowed you to be a man of the crowd, to move through shock, encounter, collision, unpredictable meetings. So there was all of that, along with the melancholia, the isolation, the alienation that kind of situation can provoke. And the other side, apart from rupture, the other side of Baudelaire that has always deeply appealed to me is what I would characterize as his epiphanic side. The ability to be seized by the rapture of the sublime in the middle of the city, in the middle of the crowd, in the middle of all the strange chimerical experiences that a metropolis can provide. There's suddenly the sense of a vast open horizon from which surprises and shocks can emanate. So it's an expansion of consciousness. So it's this, the ability to move into the labyrinth of the city and lose oneself, but also the ability to experience the horizon and the sky and difference, the ocean even, and to be somehow ecstatic in that moment. So these are the two aspects of Baudelaire that appeal to me greatly, rupture and epiphany. And as I've gone along, I've also come to treasure the way in which he thinks through, or he feels through, so much of his thinking is embodied thinking. He thinks through questions of what it means to be an individual, what it means to be a sovereign, feeling and reflective subject, an affective and reflective subject, but also what sort of relationship can one form with the crowd?
Yeah.
What forms of democracy are we thinking of where one doesn't get simply absorbed into a populism? How does one retain one's critical and dissenting perspective? To me, that's what I take, for instance, from many of the essays gathered here, including The Painter of Modern Life. And over the years, I've come more and more to cherish 4 19th century poets who wrote in different languages and who were all contemporaries, though our pedagogy sometimes makes us see them in different frames. I'm thinking of Baudelaire, thinking of Heinrich Heine, who wrote in German, of course, Whitman, and Ghalib, who wrote in Urdu. So these, to me, are foundational figures: Baudelaire, Heine, Whitman, and Ghalib. And although they wrote in different languages, occupied seemingly different social structures and situations, they each have this in common: the rupture and the epiphany, the questioning and the critical embrace of democracy, yet the notion of what does it mean to be a kaleidoscopic individual. So this is where I would situate Baudelaire. I would not make a cult of Baudelaire. I think it's actually more useful to see him in this expanded context. And just in terms of being a kind of exemplar of practice, his practice was a hybrid one, as is mine. I've come to cherish Baudelaire because he really went out there, and without institutional support, he was not a man of private means. He actually went out there and struggled as an independent writer, what we would today think of as a freelance writer. So there he was, with all of his linguistic experimentation as a poet, which wasn't even particularly recognized in his day. There he was as an art critic, embracing his contemporaries in the visual arts, thinking through important questions of the role of painting in the representation of new experiences, the discovery of new vocabularies of affect. And there he was as a translator. Again, a transoceanic connection with Poe, despite the highly idiosyncratic reasons for responding to Poe. The fact is that he was able to make these trans-regional, transcontinental connections. So there again, you have him not as a protector of a Francophone or a French culture as being somehow supreme, but also someone who was osmotic in his ability to respond to other cultures and other languages. And I'll close by citing a strange little essay that has been with me for the longest time, which is The Philosophy of Toys. There's a certain elegiac quality to this essay, which if you haven't, I'm sure you've all read it, but if those who haven't among our auditors here, it would be wonderful if you read it. It really pivots around the moment when a child wonders what makes a toy work and breaks that toy open, finds that there's nothing inside of it. And out of this very everyday childhood memory, he actually creates a whole metaphysic of despair, disappointment, and yet why one needs to continue with the enchantment of creativity, why one needs to seek out this magic, even if one knows that there's nothing at the center. And it's this kind of drive to create, even in the face of ambient despair, that is, for me, a key lesson that I take away from Baudelaire. Thank you for your attention.
Well, Ranjit, I mean, that was very interesting and fascinating, because you obviously, I mean, highlight an aspect of Baudelaire which is not often discussed, but is a very core integral part of him, which made him him as a critic, him as somebody who commented on the painters of his time. His essays on the salons are legendary. I mean, everyone goes through a point if they're literary to read it. And it's interesting that you end with this essay on the philosophy of toys, because the preoccupation in that essay is something which permeates through a lot of his prose. It comes through, the grappling which I referred to earlier. It comes through beautifully in that essay. And a lot of the things that even, you see the little parts of it that make up the whole of the man in the trail he leaves in his essays. And it's also very interesting how you expanded the context. I mean, now that you say it, by including Heinrich Heimer and Whitman and Galeb, yes, but of course, now that you say it, yes, of course. They were all doing this interesting experimentation, and they were, as you called it, the kaleidoscope of the individual. Very interesting, very fascinating. And maybe there is scope for an international seminar one day on those topics, because I think that is the beauty of the age that we live in. We now are able to we discuss things at the intersection of many disciplines, and if we can, and now the ease with which we are more accepting of other cultures and languages. Maybe it's a blessing of the internet, I don't know, but we are very much more accepting to cadences of languages and understanding. It is something worth discussing and taking forward, and seeing how you are familiar with these languages, so you're able to bring it forward. But let's see whether it actually affects other literary spaces. We'll come back to this later.
May I just say that I have a title for that event if it will ever happen?
Yeah.
Rupture and Rapture.
Sounds good. Yeah, sounds good. worth exploring.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we should invite Anupama. Yeah, we should do it. That's how dreams come. That's how creativity takes forward. May I please invite Anupama to come to take the floor and to talk about Baudelaire and herself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jaya. And Rupture and Rapture indeed needs to talk about Baudelaire. Thank you to Institut Français, Christine, and the entire team. It's nice to be listening to all of you. So for me, there are three things I'd like to highlight. One is some of the adjectives that are commonly used to describe this man. Right? Somber, lyrical, dark, and of course this whole idea of a vagabond poet. This, once you kind of get through those layers and labels, you find such a rich repertoire that it's difficult to really put a finger on what he actually wrote about, because there were so many influences, and I think so many themes. So as someone who practices poetry, this is what appealed to me the most. And it is his poetry that I relate to the most. Of course, prose and his essays and his arguments and his insistences on the responsibility of an artist, what a poet must preoccupy herself with. All of them are relevant, no doubt, especially in this age. But it is his poetry that appeals to me the most. And some of those adjectives I can relate to myself. I wouldn't dare compare myself to Baudelaire. But I remember some of these responses I have received over the years. What you write is very dark. What you write is very dark, and can't you write about nice things? Does it have to be like this? And anyway, one writes what one writes. So that is one thing that I wanted to share with all of you. Second thing is the sense of place, which is so strong. The sense of city, travel, which has influenced his work so much. I mean, even if you look at Les Fleurs du Mal, the fact that when you think of Paris and the paradox of Paris, for instance. I love French, you know, but I'm thinking of my first visual of Paris when I arrived there ages ago. And it was from a bus. I was traveling to Paris from Vichy. And it was, the first sight I saw was of Eiffel from a very industrial part of the town. So just to tell you the truth, it was very ugly. But as you discover the city, there you have the paradox. You have the beauty and the ugliness. And I think Baudelaire, one of the things he says is, I mean, as you all know, you can write about anything and everything. And there again, I was reminded of one of my mentors who really got me writing poetry seriously, Ayappa Panikar. He used to tell me, you could write about anything, even a pothole, you know, and anything. It really doesn't matter. You don't have to write about only what is beautiful and only what is appealing. So that is one of the things that I could immediately relate to. Travel has always, I'm sure for all of you, being away from what is familiar, being away from home, isolation, distancing. I think it gives a certain power to your words, something about it, as depressing as it may be. It has informed my work in many ways. It's something that we all miss these days. And interestingly, these days, the sense of city has become a preoccupation for me. Cities have become very important. They seem to be repetitively figuring in what I'm writing. Even in the collaborations I had done some years ago with a French photographer, there was Pondicherry, there was La Rochelle, and now various cities, the cities that I really love in India, Bombay, Delhi, you know, they're all there. So I just want to read a couple of lines before I move on to the third point, or maybe I will make my third point and I'll come back to the points. The third point, thank you. The third point is how, strangely enough, Baudelaire seems to influence my day job as well. I would have never made an association, but it's something I realized of late. I do have a day job in the corporate sector. Ranjit often makes fun of that. But in the sense, I head internal communications for an IT company. Nothing to do, you know, I'm not at all a technology person. But we have a daily newsletter that goes out to our employees every day. And it's almost, and every week we come up with a theme. Now, these themes often, I mean, I draw them from symbols and little metaphors. And many of them I recently realized seem to have figured in Baudelaire's poems. For instance, the theme next week for our newsletter is pattern. So, I mean, we usually have fun with it. There's a lot of poetry that figures in this corporate newsletter. I enjoy a lot of freedom there, professional freedom, thanks to the organization I work at. So it's this very strange relationship that I seem to share with this man. So at the end of it, these are the three things that I wanted to say, and I don't think I have enough time. Perhaps after the surprise, there's time.
No, just recite because a lot of what you've said has led up to what you wanted to read out. So read a couple of lines. We can always come back. It's always a pleasure to have it together in one place. Go ahead.
Thank you. So one of his poems, which really spoke to me a lot, is the poem called Le Voyage. I think it's the last of the book, Les Fleurs du Mal. And this concept of travel and, you know, going away. For the benefit of our audience, I'll read it in English translation. But the true travelers are they who depart, for departing's sake, with hearts light as balloons. They never swerve from their destinies, saying continuously, without knowing why, let us go on. For me, that just kind of, it just increases my longing for travel. And of course, in French, it's beautiful. But Jaya, talking about the point you made earlier, the thing is, there are so many translations available, and some of them some excellent translations I have found. So I think it does justice. But if just to kind of bring out the music of the French language, mais les vrais voyageurs sont ceux-là seuls qui partent pour partir, cœur léger, semblable au ballon de leur fatalité. Jamais ils ne s'écartent et sans savoir pourquoi disent toujours allons. So it's just I thought it was a lovely poem. If we have time at a later point, I will read a poem that I recently wrote, which brings out a sense of the sense of city and place. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, that was very nice, Anupama, because of course, this is the point where we will also break for the surprise, so it segues beautifully. But apart from that, I truly appreciate the fact that you stressed upon Baudelaire's notion of the city and how everybody else, as Ranjit very beautifully put it, inheritors of his legacy, explore the city. And he made it possible. The way he looked at it, he made it possible. You can use beautiful words or you can call him what you will, but he made it possible to talk about the city, warts and all. And I also like the fact that you talked about the translations in English and as well as read the original in French, because one of the things I was discussing with Christine a little while ago was that I can't access him in French. But I have actually been listening to a lot of his poetry in French to understand the rhythm and the beauty and the meter. I don't understand the words, but I can appreciate the music in it. And I mean, that is obviously divorced from the content. I mean, we're not talking about that right now. But that is the whole experience. And that is what I think one of the things that he tries to bring to his fore in his craftsmanship. How do you bring it all together? I mean, this is something which all artists will always grapple with their output, with their work, with their creativity. What is it that brings it together? Maybe now is a great time to break for the surprise, which is a perfect, as I said, a perfect segue, Anupama, from your words, is a film with music based on Baudelaire's Lecture. I hope I pronounced it well. The music is by Jeet and Hollis, and the film is by Namita Avriti. Clement, may we please have the film now? Thank you.
Between boredom and disease, give me boredom, or stupor, or terror. Give me the disappearing trees, but fill me up. Don't make me say, stop, enough. Enough with that pin-thin soup. I'm not dead just yet, am I? Oh wait, perhaps I am. I've done no wrong. I'll rephrase that. I've done no wrong to you. Not yet. Not when I'm playing sad amnesiac. My tears aimed at the last row, at the cheap seats. My eyes dry and my confessions so sharp worn. You'll buy new ones, won't you, dear reader? Who's singing those soft mermaid songs and road shanties? That lovely old smut. Lickle Beelzebub or the boss. I like when she tells me to toss on past the shells and used bodies. When she trills, shout if you want more. Shout, the road's redder, each step lighter than the one before. She's not alone, she's a hive, a teeming lake, a vast interlocked mass of connecting states, so alive in my brain and my lungs when I draw deep down, down into my thirst sacs, her killing river, and shout, more sister, more. To read, don't you, dear reader? The 86-year-old grandmother raped by a guy pretending to be the milkman. You like the details, don't you? The bruises on her legs, the cuts on her face, the vaginal bleeding and how she begged for mercy. All that you like, don't you, dear reader? But you want more, more, you want more. So you pick among the lice, grabber that you are, giggle, monster of vice. You pick carefully. There are so many within, too many. Though none as artful as you, my yawner, my dreamer of murder, my hypocrite reader, my lover, my twin. Hypocrite reader, my lover, my twin. Hypocrite reader, my twin.
That was lovely. That was really lovely. Thank you, Jeet. Thank you very much. And please thank your father as well.
Oh,
It was
of course.
absolutely amazing to see him in the opening of the film. Thank you.
There's also a lot of us worked on the making of that. Not just me, there was Hollis Coates with the music and the production, and Namita Vrithi with the film making, and of course all the people who sent videos of themselves reading, you know.
It came together beautifully. Thank you. I hope you'll put it up on YouTube so that it can be circulated.
Yes.
May I invite Christine at this point? I believe she is going to read a translation of one of your poems, Jeet, in French. Yes.
Oh,
so,
I think the same one?
Yes, you reader.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and may I just introduce Christine to the audience? Christine Cornet is the attaché at the Institute of the French Institute in India, and she is the main force behind this extraordinary event. And thank you, Christine. Now over to you to read the translation.
À toi, lecteur. Entre l'ennui et la maladie, choisis l'ennui, l'hébétude ou la terreur. Donne-moi des arbres évanescents, mais rassasie-moi. Ne me fais pas dire « Arrête, assez de ce bouillon clair. Je ne suis pas mort, non? Oh, à moins que je n'ai rien fait de mal. Laisse-moi dire ça autrement. Je ne t'ai rien fait de mal. Pas encore mal. Pas quand je joue triste amnésique, mes larmes ciblent le dernier rang, mes places bon marché, mes yeux secs et mes aveux si défraîchis que tu en achèteras des neufs. Qui chante ces douces chansonnettes de sirènes et chansons de rue? Cette charmante vieillerie, Likel Bilzebub ou le boss. J'aime quand elle me dit de continuer à avancer au-delà des coquillages et des corps usés, quand elle fait des trilles, crie si tu en veux plus. La route est plus rouge, chaque pas plus léger que le précédent. Elle n'est pas seule, c'est une ruche, un lac grouillant, une vaste masse imbriquée, des états connectés, si vivantes dans mon cerveau et mes poumons. Quand je puise profondément, au fond de mes sacs assoiffés, sa rivière fatale, et que je crie « Plus, ma sœur, encore plus !» Tu aimes lire. La grand-mère de 86 ans, violée par un mec prétendant être le laitier. Tu aimes les détails, les échymoses sur ses jambes, les coupures sur son visage, le saignement de son ventre, et comment elle a imploré la pitié. Tout cela, tu l'aimes. N'est-ce pas, cher lecteur? Mais tu en veux plus, toujours plus. Alors tu choisis, parmi les poux, l'attrapeur que tu es, monstre de rire du fils, choisis prudemment. Il y en a trop à l'intérieur, mais aucun aussi astucieux que toi, mon bailleur. Rêveur de meurtre, lecteur hypocrite, mon amant, mon jumeau.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Was that by Bernard, the translation?
Translated by Akriti Alawala from the French Institute and from the team of the French Book Office. Merci, Akriti.
I loved it, and I think I'm also going to say that if Baudelaire had heard that, he would not have been displeased.
Nicely said. Nicely said. No, I'm glad Christine had it translated because she had been toying with the idea, and it works beautifully with this with the whole celebration of Baudelaire and of course your interpretation. But anyway, I think we are running out of time. But I do, and we are getting questions as well from the floor. but there are some interesting points of view that all of you raised that I would really like to quickly touch upon. Starting first, of course, with Amrita, who talked about the gaze and our reactions to Baudelaire changing over a period of time. So, I mean, Amrita, would you like to elaborate a little more about that as well? And then I would like everybody else to jump in as and when. So, do they also feel that that Baudelaire changes for them over a period of time, or does that first reading of Baudelaire remain with you forever, and does it become important? Amrita, go ahead.
I think Baudelaire brings me back to my younger self, and the same self that I was at the moment when I first read him. And so in that vein, I could still love and appreciate it in the same way. When I recall Jeet's poem that says goodbye to Baudelaire, it ends with the sentence, dumb, boyish admiration. And it was something that really spoke to me, that there's a certain childlike relationship to some Baudelaire work gets right for me when I read Each Adult. And they're important for me.
Your voice broke at the last minute.
It's just that internet and Goa, it always happens.
Okay, so I didn't get quite the last bit, but what I would really also like to touch upon is that one of the things which is emerging in a lot of contemporary conversations about Baudelaire is that, first of all, there's this great deal of emphasis on his poetry, which fortunately this conversation so far has expanded. I mean, has discussed Baudelaire as a man and as a writer and essayist. But when we focus on Baudelaire as a poet, we tend to talk about his poetry and his love and the women, the objectification of women. My point is, do you think Baudelaire is relevant? Do you think people, given the kind of debates and conversations happening about in feminism or with Me Too, etc., does it in any way impact our reading, our engagement with Baudelaire, or should we not read a poet of 200 years ago with today's perspective? What do you think about that?
I just think it's on how you inhabit the poems when you read them. As I said, when I reread To a Malabar Girl, it still awakened something important in me, even though my critical 45-year-old eyes can look at it and say, oh gosh, that's terrible, and why is he saying that? But there's still pleasure, and I can own to still having that pleasure, because certain lines of the poem, the musicality of it also alight something in you, and that I think goes beyond the critical gaze, at least for me.
That's interesting, because it's something which is coming up a lot. I mean, it's coming up a lot. In fact, the conversations about this, and I just think personally, I think that I agree with you, Amrita, because I think somewhere we need to while we can analyze his poetry with today's academic learnings and all the rest of it, somewhere we also need to just recognize the man for who he is in his period and for what it is, you know. I mean, he's writing within his period, within his context. Whether we choose to dissect it in other ways of today's readings is something which is a very personal view and doesn't necessarily have to be there. Does anybody else have to say anything about?
I think it depends.
Tell me.
If I may add, I think it depends upon also on how you read the poem. And if you read the whole poem and then look at each sentence and sort of expand upon each sentence, maybe you'd have a more critical gaze to it. But I don't read like that. I read a poem and then I fall into a sentence and I sort of sit there for a bit, and it feels very good to me. So I think a lot depends on how you read.
Yeah. Does anyone else have comments?
I think that's exactly the right way to read a poem.
Yes.
You know, to fall into it because of a phrase or or its music or an idea. I think that's exactly the way to absorb a poem. I'm just going on from something that we've been talking about. I'm struck again by the fact, the cityfied nature of Baudelaire's work and how much the city informed it, and how much that has to do with the fact that this work has aged so well. These poems have aged so well and absolutely speak to us today. And you can keep translating these poems in today's idiom, in whichever country you might be in, whichever language you might be using, and you could make it absolutely relevant to your moment and your environment. And the idea that he had a democratic sense of humanity, he absolutely did, because so much of his work was built around the idea of the flaneur, the man who walks on a city street and looks at what's happening. And one of the lines, I can't remember which poem this is from, but he's walking down the street and he passes somebody who recalls to him the fact that he is unwell, he's sick, whereas this person who passes by is full of health, and he can see the health emanating from just her shoulder, just her arm. And this idea of being part of this mass of humanity, strangers walking on the street, that is, again, absolutely modern. It is democratic, but at the same time, we have to remember that Baudelaire had a very clear sense of his separateness from the rest of mankind. He felt he was superior to everybody else. And I'd like to suggest that this was not an idea born out of class, because he was poor for much of his life. He was always in trouble for money, always asking his mother for money. He was so poor for so much of his life. This had nothing to do with class, the sense of his superiority. And to get a sense of that poem, The Albatross, where he equates the albatross that cannot walk on land but is majestic in the air, he equates that bird to the poet. So I'd like to suggest that the reason he felt himself separate and superior to those around him is not a matter of class, but a matter of craft, of poetry.
No, I'm so glad you raised that, Jeet, because that is something which one tends to easily forget when immersed in his works, reading, that you forget his impoverished circumstances, the hardships, and yet he was so focused on his craft, and he did things. He was, the way he wrote, he poured his soul into everything he wrote, and he struggled. We all know he struggled. He died a poor man. He died in horrible circumstances, and irrespective of where he was born and how his mother supported him, and of course some of the other women in his life, they supported him. This man, we remember him for his work. We remember him for his criticism. We remember him for his theories of art. And in fact, and his craftsmanship, his experimentation. In fact, this is where, Ranjit, I would like to bring you in and ask you about this whole form of the prose poem that is very often associated with Baudelaire. I mean, there are many, as you rightly point out, there are many other poets who are experimenting, but it's sort of synonymous with Baudelaire. It is something which is evident sometimes in your poetry, most notably in Hunch prose and the opening poem. Would you like to comment upon that as well as the form?
Thanks so much, Jaya. Two things. I will respond to this question, but I think I would situate it in the kind of historic moment that Baudelaire played such a major role in. He, the phalanx of writers around him, and the visual artists, they really embody what we now recognize to be the avant-garde moment. There was a paradox to what they were doing. On the one hand, they were, through rupture and rapture, they were breaking new ground, they were discovering crafting new languages of art making, and they were gesturing towards a new form of how art was to be made and to be experienced. And to that extent, they were leaving behind, if you will, their audience, their readers, their viewers. And this gulf opening up between artists and audiences is something that you can graph across this period. The collapse of the academy and its canons, the emergence of dramatic new ways of writing, painting, making sculpture. So the paradox there is that on the one hand, a poet, a writer like Baudelaire wanted to reach out to these new universes of art making. And at the same time, there was, I would think, a certain pensive, melancholic feeling that there would be a lack of understanding. Where was hence often enough the address to the reader, reaching out to the reader. What reader was that? It was probably a reader from the future, a guest from the future who would read these things. There's a kind of sadness to this. So I'd situate the turn to the prose poem in this gap, actually. And he wasn't alone. I mean, I think it's Mallarmé who says somewhere that prose doesn't exist. There's just poetry that moves at different speeds. And it's an absolutely marvelous way of thinking about it. So I'd like to think of the choice of the prose poem with many of these French poets particularly as emanating from this desire to have a kind of utterance that would at least deceptively seem to be something that everybody could share in, and yet have a very specific cadence and tonality that comes only from the individual poet. So the prose poem becomes then both an invitation and a challenge. It's a way of saying to the reader, look, this is the kind of utterance that any of us could utter. It's prose, Another great French author talks about how someone wakes up and discovers that he's been speaking prose all his life, right? So I think there's a lot of playfulness around the prose poem. So as an invitation, it says to the reader, this is not marked off and demarcated as avant-garde territory. Start speaking it, start reading it, and there's nothing to be afraid of. And as you get into it, the challenges open up. There are all kinds of little gestures, there are surprises, there are ambushes within the body of the prose poem. So I think it's both common ground and it's a minefield. It's a challenge and it's an invitation. And it really belongs to this moment where you're both defying your audience and you're trying to make a connection with it.
No. I mean, I'm glad that you said that, because I mean, those kind of explorations, I think he continued to work with till the very end. And that is something which can never come to a satisfying conclusion, because the moment you grapple with it, you write it, you deal with it, your sense of what you're wishing to achieve, that goalpost keeps shifting, because you have achieved another level of understanding and of creativity and sophistication. And that's why I found it very curious that you put Whitman in the same space, because Whitman does this constantly. He's constantly, even with the Leaves of Grass, he's constantly editing it and redoing it. He's never satisfied with what he does, and he continues. And that pursuit of I would say excellence, that pursuit of reaching something to a satisfactory level in your creativity, that zenith, that analogy which Jeet used of the albatross, which is of course Baudelaire's, those kind, reaching that epiphany. How do you yearn? You yearn for it, but do you achieve it? Which format do you explore it in? And one of the things which is extraordinary about Baudelaire is when you read him chronologically and don't necessarily access him first through his poetry, a lot of his poetry makes sense. It's as if, as you very nicely pointed out the other day, Ranjit, in one of your podcasts, was poetry is considered this quaint version, but you discuss a lot of things in prose. The prose seems to be this is the age of prose. But I think I think this is something in common with all of you over here as well. Your explorations of the art and of the critic and of a practitioner, the word which you used, I found it very good, makes itself felt in that poetry. It distills it, because I think the way we discover more and more layers in poetry is something which comes through in Baudelaire, comes through in your poetry, comes through in Jeet's poetry, and comes through in these renditions, like this musical interlude that Jeet so nicely provided us. There are so many ways in which we can interpret it, and that subjective interpretation, the impact on the reader, the impact on the auditor, is what I think is what also Baudelaire is constantly bringing to the fore. How do you create that art? How do you create that cultural ecosystem? How do you bring it into commenting on society as well? And I think that is also what makes him so modern. You know, I think that is what is, and I mean, I'm sure we can have these conversations over and a lot, and I do wish to carry on, but we've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience. There is actually a question, Ranjit, for you from Deepthi, who says, for those of us who are seeking to dig our teeth a little deeper, could you please share some works of Baudelaire that shed light on being modern and an urban citizen? Or could you please share some of your views on the same?
Oh,
This is from Deepthi.
I mean, honestly, the three key essays for me are the two essays on Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, his life and works, and further notes on Poe. And The Painter of Modern Life. It's an accordion of magical sections. And to my mind, The Painter of Modern Life really offers us one of the key and absolutely current definitions of what it means to be modern, the elusiveness, the fugitive quality of the modern, and held in place. And he offers this Plato-like dyad when he says that what we experience as the modern is all that is elusive and fugitive and ephemeral. And the other side of it is what is eternal, what is perennial, what lasts forever. So this push-pull between the eternal and the ephemeral, what is very much of the now and what is classical. I mean, we all experience that as makers of one art or another, and as people who are, you know, caught up on this tide of modernity. So to me, that is the key essay. I mean, there's much else that he wrote, but The Painter of Modern Life is inexhaustible on this subject.
Oh, thank you. There's another question from Devika to the panelists. In your opinion, does Baudelaire equate the concept of excess to beauty? Who would like to take it? Amrita, because I think you mentioned it first. Amrita? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I'm not sure of my response yet.
Well, while you're formulating an opinion, Anupama, would you like to come in and talk about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm someone who's always enjoyed extremes. So I think when I think of excess, that is what comes to my mind, right? There can be beauty in excess, and there can be beauty in extremes. And at various points in today's conversation, whether it was Ranjit or Jeet or Amrita, they all brought up this element, these two points. So I think he got us thinking about that, but perhaps we all appreciate it, and there is certain beauty in excess. I mean, what's the fun in controlling it?
Jeet, would you like to add to it?
Does Amrita have?
Amrita is still thinking, I think.
No. Well, no, I'm just going to quote another poet, and I'm going to say, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom.
Oh, perfect. Okay, before we conclude, I mean, there are more questions coming in. Obviously, people have enjoyed this, but we are running short of time. But I made a promise to Anupama, and I would like to fulfill it. You had a poem to recite, Anupama. Can maybe please conclude with that? I think it'll be a perfect conclusion to this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Jaya. But are you sure? Because
yes, we have time. We have time. Go ahead. Please go ahead. It perfectly does it.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is a poem I recently wrote, and I'm happy to present it to this audience because I'm reading it for the first time.
Thank you.
And the reason I'm reading it is because there's a very strong sense of place and a strong presence of the city. I think that's something we all spoke about today, and so the city and Baudelaire. And it's also a very personal response to a city. And Ranjit was talking about prose poems. So it's interesting, and it's a surprise for him as well. Of late, I've been writing these epistolary poems to poets who've become really dear friends over the last few years. So so this is a poem I addressed to Ranjit about. I'm going to just read it. Dear Ranjit, I must have been 8 years old when I first arrived in your Bombay. I had only heard your city speak through family gossip and film songs till then. Must have been a long journey. I don't remember much of it. But it was in your car. My grandmother bought the bangles she always wore. Thick, fluorescent, commanding. I wear them now to not remember. To not remember that it is your city that brought me the simple joy of cliches, of bhel and vada pav, of eating in Irani cafes I had learned from studying Nissim. Linking Road, Khar, Marine Drive, wide as warm welcome. Walking, eating ice cream from a cone on a road I don't recall. I also remember the indulgent granduncle who died too soon. Mother, brother, grandaunts, or the air filled with Akashvani, the studio and sound all too familiar. I think of them now to not remember. To not remember that I kept traveling to your Bombay, where I spoke Hindi and smiled every time Marathi dropped heavy, sweet, like ghee. The ruckus had to become part of me. We didn't meet there, Ranjit. No. But when we finally did, do you recall listening to me talking about my love for your Bombay? I think of that restaurant, that dinner, that faraway evening, to not remember. To not remember that your Bombay draws me like the cities of my love. To never remember that it's your Bombay where I heard night words coming to life in the gardens of David Sassoon, where I read, listened, forgot, dreamed, awoke, and slept. I long for Bombay, yours and mine. So I speak to your Lord of lost perspectives, wishing for a journey again to your Bombay to remember what I've gained again. The Lord of Lost Perspectives is from his poem, Baldachin Jonaville. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think that's the best way to conclude. There's so much which has been said. I hope we have celebrated Baudelaire. We definitely have to have that conference, Rapture and Rupture, and Christine, thank you very much for making this possible. Thank you very much to the French Institute in India for inviting us all to be here to have this conversation. And we look forward one day to meeting in person and celebrating this phenomenal man. Thank you, Jeet. Thank you, Ranjit. Thank you, Anupama.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jaya.
This was marvelous.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.